I remember the moment the lie between us finally snapped. I was lying in that hospital bed, chest tight, vision blurring, when my daughter-in-law leaned over me with that practiced sweetness she uses on everyone but me. Then, without warning, she yanked my breathing tube free and whispered, "Stop pretending," as if my struggle for air was just another inconvenience in her path to my late wife's inheritance. My son stood there, silent, eyes lowered, even as I choked on nothing but panic and betrayal. Neither of them noticed the surgeon frozen in the doorway, watching every second of what they had just done. They thought it would stay a secret, that I was too weak to expose them, that the fortune my wife left behind would soon be theirs. They had no idea the will reading was coming, or that a single witness could shatter everything they had planned in the most public way possible. When the doctor placed a steady hand on my daughter-in-law's shoulder and spoke 6 quiet words, the world they had carefully built cracked open. I did not say a word then. I did not need to, because what neither of them knew was that I had already begun preparing for this moment long before that hospital room. And before this story ends, they will understand exactly who they tried to destroy and why taking my last breath would have been far kinder than what was waiting for them next. My name is Robert Hayes. I am 72 years old, a retired structural engineer who spent 4 decades building bridges across Texas. I always believed that if you constructed something with integrity, it would hold. I never imagined that principle would one day apply to my own survival. The fluorescent lights of Methodist Hospital hummed above me as I lay in the narrow bed, an oxygen tube resting beneath my nose. My chest felt tight, each breath a small negotiation with lungs that no longer cooperated the way they once did. The doctors called it a respiratory episode, brought on by stress and age. They wanted to keep me overnight for observation. I did not argue. I had learned over the past 2 years that silence was often more powerful than speech. The door opened without a knock. Lydia walked in first, her heels clicking against the linoleum with the rhythm of someone who owned every room she entered. My son Mark followed behind her, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on the floor. He looked like a man walking toward his own execution. "You're awake," Lydia said. It was not a question. She stood at the foot of my bed, arms crossed, studying me the way a hawk studies a mouse. "The nurses said you were sleeping, but I knew better." I said nothing. I had stopped trying to explain myself to Lydia years ago. Every word I offered became a weapon she turned against me. We brought the documents. She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a manila folder. "The ones you were supposed to sign last week. Before this convenient little hospital visit." Mark shifted uncomfortably near the window. His jaw was tight, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He would not look at me. He had not truly looked at me in months. "I am not faking an illness, Lydia," I said quietly. "The doctors can confirm that. Doctors confirm whatever patients want them to confirm." She dropped the folder onto the blanket covering my legs. "Sign the property transfer. Today. I'm done waiting." The property she meant was the house Elaine and I had built together 38 years ago. The home where we raised Mark, where we celebrated anniversaries and weathered storms, where my wife took her final breath in my arm. Lydia wanted it transferred into Mark's name, which meant into her control. I had been resisting for months, and my resistance had become intolerable to her. "I need time to review the documents again," I said. "You've had time." Her voice sharpened. "You've had months. What you're doing is stalling, and I won't tolerate it anymore." She stepped closer, leaning over the bed rail, her perfume overwhelming the sterile hospital air. "Sign it, Robert, or I swear to God, I will make whatever time you have left absolutely miserable." I looked past her toward Mark, my son, my only child, the boy I had taught to ride a bicycle and throw a football. He stood frozen, his face a mask of anguish. He knew what his wife was. He had always known, but he had chosen her over me, again and again, and that choice had hollowed something out of both of us. "Mark," I said softly, "say something." He opened his mouth, then closed it. His eyes glistened, but no words came. Lydia laughed, a cold sound that echoed off the walls. "He has nothing to say. He knows I'm right." She straightened, glaring down at me. "You're pathetic. You know that? A pathetic old faker who thinks he can manipulate everyone with his sad little act." Then she reached down and yanked the oxygen tube from my face. The air vanished from my lungs. I gasped, my hands flying to my throat, my chest seizing with the sudden deprivation. For 3, 4, 5 horrible seconds, The world became nothing but desperate need and burning emptiness. And then I saw him. Dr. Samuel Rourke stood in the doorway, his phone raised, frozen mid-conversation with a colleague on a video call. His eyes were wide with shock. He had seen everything. Lydia saw him too. Her hand flew back from the tube as if it had burned her. But here is the strange thing, the detail that perhaps only I understood in that moment. As I fought for breath, as my vision blurred at the edges, I felt no panic. There was fear, yes, the primal terror of suffocation, but beneath it, deeper than instinct, was something else entirely. Calm, almost relief, because I had known this day would come. My wife Elaine had warned me, in her final weeks, that Lydia would eventually show her true nature. She had made me promise to be ready, and I had been preparing, quietly and patiently, for 2 long years. In the hallway, just visible through the open door, my granddaughter Emily sat on a plastic chair, her iPad clutched to her chest. She had a habit of recording things, random moments she found interesting. I wondered briefly if her camera had been pointed this direction. I wondered if anyone understood yet that the frail old man in the hospital bed was not a victim. He was a trap that had just been sprung. Dr. Rourke moved faster than I expected for a man of his age. He was perhaps 60, with silver hair and the steady hands of someone who had spent decades navigating emergencies. Within seconds, he had crossed the room and replaced the oxygen tube beneath my nose. The flow of air returned like mercy, filling my starved lungs with relief I could not adequately describe. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" His voice was controlled but carried an edge sharp enough to cut glass. He was not looking at me. He was staring at Lydia with an expression I had seen only a few times in my life, the kind of cold fury that required no volume to communicate its danger. Lydia stepped back, her composure cracking for the first time since I had known her. I was just adjusting his tube. It was loose. I was helping him. "I watched you yank it from his face." Dr. Rourke held up his phone, the screen still glowing. So did my colleague in the cardiology department, who happens to still be on this video call. "Every second of what you just did is now recorded." The color drained from Lydia's face. For a moment, she looked almost human, almost afraid. Then her mask slid back into place, though not quite as seamlessly as before. "You're misinterpreting what you saw. I am a physician with 32 years of experience," Dr. Rourke said quietly. "I know exactly what I saw. What you did constitutes elder abuse under Texas law. That is a criminal offense, potentially a felony depending on the circumstances. I suggest you leave this room immediately before I have security escort you out in handcuffs." Mark finally moved. He grabbed Lydia's arm, his face pale and stricken. "We should go. Lydia, we need to go now." She jerked away from him but did not argue. Her eyes met mine for a single burning second, filled with hatred so pure it was almost beautiful in its intensity. Then she turned and walked out, her heels clicking a faster rhythm than when she had entered. Mark followed without looking back, a ghost trailing behind the storm. The door closed. Silence filled the room like water filling a vessel. Dr. Rourke pulled a chair beside my bed and sat down heavily. He rubbed his face with one hand, looking suddenly exhausted. "Mr. Hayes, are you all right? Do you need me to call anyone else? A nurse, perhaps, or the police?" I shook my head slowly. My heart was still pounding, but my breathing had steadied. The oxygen flowed cool and clean into my lungs. "I am fine. Thank you for what you did. I did what any decent person would do." He paused, studying me with an expression I could not quite read. There was something in his eyes beyond professional concern, something personal that did not make sense given that we had never met before today. "Actually, that is not entirely true. I did what I promised I would do." I looked at him more carefully then. His face was familiar in a vague, half-remembered way, like a photograph seen once and then forgotten. "What do you mean?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I made a promise to someone, Mr. Hayes, a promise to keep an eye on you, to make sure I was nearby if anything ever happened. I did not ask who." The answer was already forming in my chest, a warmth spreading outward from somewhere deeper than memory. Only one person had ever cared enough to plan that far ahead. Only one person had ever loved me with such fierce, meticulous devotion. "Elaine," I whispered. Dr. Rourke nodded slowly. "I was her physician during her final months. When the cancer became terminal and we moved to palliative care, I spent many hours with her. She was an extraordinary woman. Even when her body was failing, her mind remained sharp as a blade. She spoke of you constantly. I closed my eyes, feeling the sting of tears I would not allow to fall. 3 years since she had passed, and the grief still ambushed me at unexpected moments. She was worried about you, Dr. Rourke continued gently. She told me things about your family situation that concerned her deeply, about your son's wife, about the way that woman looked at your assets like a vulture circling prey. Elaine was dying, but her greatest fear was not death. Her greatest fear was leaving you unprotected. She never told me any of this, I said, my voice rough. She did not want to burden you. She wanted you to focus on spending your remaining time together, not on her suspicions. He paused. But she also refused to leave anything to chance. She asked me to transfer my practice to this hospital after she passed. She asked me to keep you in my peripheral vision, to watch for signs of trouble, and she gave me a name. My hand moved involuntarily toward the bedside drawer, where the small brown notebook rested beneath a stack of tissues and a paperback novel. 2 years of documentation, 2 years of meticulous records. Elaine had told me to write everything down, to prepare myself for the moment when preparation would matter most. I had followed her instructions faithfully, never fully understanding the scope of her planning. Now I was beginning to understand. What name? I asked, though some part of me already knew. Dr. Rourke reached into his coat pocket and produced a business card, slightly worn, as if it had been carried for a long time. He placed it in my hand. The name printed on the front read Grace Whitmore, attorney at law. Elaine told me that when something happens to you, I should contact this woman immediately. She said Grace Whitmore has everything you need. He met my eyes with quiet intensity. I called her this morning. Mr. Hayes, the moment I heard you had been admitted, she is already on her way. I stared at the card, at the simple black letters on cream-colored stock. My wife had been gone for 3 years, yet here she was, still orchestrating, still protecting, still loving me from somewhere beyond the reach of death. I closed my eyes and pressed the card against my chest. Elaine had known. She had always known. And she had spent her final months building a fortress around me that I was only now beginning to see. I slept poorly that night, drifting between shallow dreams and waking moments where the hospital sounds became strangely comforting. The beeping of monitors, the soft footsteps of nurses in the corridor, the distant murmur of voices at the nursing station. These sounds meant I was still alive, still breathing, still holding on to something Lydia desperately wanted to take from me. By morning, my breathing had improved enough that the doctors spoke of discharging me within a day or 2. Dr. Rourke visited briefly during his rounds, his manner professional but his eyes communicating something deeper. He did not mention our conversation from the previous evening. He did not need to. The business card belonging to Grace Whitmore remained tucked safely in my notebook, hidden in the bedside drawer where Lydia would never think to look. I was eating a tasteless breakfast of scrambled eggs and weak coffee when the door opened without warning. Lydia entered alone this time, dressed in a charcoal blazer and tailored slacks, her appearance polished to the point of intimidation. She carried a leather portfolio under one arm and a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Good morning, Robert," she said, as if yesterday had never happened, as if she had not yanked the oxygen from my lungs and watched me gasp for air. "You look much better today. The color is returning to your cheeks." I set down my fork and said nothing. I had learned that silence unsettled her more than any argument. She pulled the visitor chair close to my bed and sat down, crossing her legs with practiced elegance. "I want to apologize for yesterday. I was stressed. Mark and I have been dealing with some financial pressures, and I took it out on you unfairly. That was wrong of me." The apology was flawless in its delivery and completely hollow in its substance. Lydia did not apologize because she felt remorse. She apologized because she needed something from me. "I brought some paperwork that needs your attention," she continued, opening the leather portfolio. "Nothing complicated, just some insurance documents that require your signature. The company has been requesting updated forms, and Mark has been too busy to handle it." She extracted several pages and placed them on the rolling tray table beside my bed. Her movements were casual, almost bored, as if the documents were insignificant bureaucratic annoyances. I picked up the papers and began to read. Lydia watched me with barely concealed impatience. "You don't need to read every word, Robert. It's standard insurance language. Just sign at the bottom and I'll take care of the rest. But I continued reading, slowly and carefully, the way I had reviewed thousands of engineering contracts throughout my career. The first page was indeed insurance-related, a renewal form for a policy I vaguely recognized. The second page appeared to be a beneficiary update. The third page, however, was something else entirely. The language was dense and deliberately confusing, filled with legal terminology designed to obscure rather than clarify. But I had spent 40 years parsing complex documents. I knew how to find the meaning buried beneath layers of jargon, and there, in the fine print of paragraph 7, I found it. Property transfer authorization, full conveyance of real estate assets, effective immediately upon signature. She was trying to steal my house. Not Mark's inheritance, not some future claim, but my home. The house where Elaine and I had built our life together, the house I still lived in, still maintained, still loved. Lydia wanted me to sign it away while lying in a hospital bed, believing I was too old and confused to understand what I was surrendering. My eyes flickered involuntarily toward the bedside drawer. Just for a second, just long enough to remind myself that the notebook was still there. Every manipulation, every threat, every scheme she had attempted over the past 2 years was documented in those pages. And now I would add this moment to the record. "Is something wrong?" Lydia asked, her voice sharpening slightly. I let my hand tremble as I set down the papers. It was not entirely an act. My hands did shake sometimes, a minor tremor that age had brought uninvited, but I exaggerated it now, letting the pages flutter as I released them. "My hands," I said weakly. "They are not steady today. I cannot sign anything properly. The signature would be illegible." Lydia's jaw tightened. "Then, I'll guide your hand. We can do it together." "No." I shook my head slowly, playing the role of the frail old man she believed me to be. "The doctor said I need rest, perhaps in a few days, when I am stronger." Her mask slipped then, just for a moment. The polished smile vanished, replaced by something cold and predatory. She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that would not carry beyond the bed. "You don't have a choice, old man. This is going to happen whether you cooperate or not. The only question is whether it happens the easy way or the hard way." A small sound came from the doorway. We both turned. Emily stood at the threshold, her iPad clutched against her chest with both hands. Her eyes were wide, fixed on her mother with an expression I recognized immediately. It was fear, the pure, unfiltered fear of a child who has seen something she does not fully understand but knows instinctively is wrong. "Emily," Lydia's voice snapped like a whip. "What are you doing here?" "I told you to wait in the car." "I had to go to the bathroom," Emily whispered. "The nurse said I could come up." "Get out, now. Wait in the hallway." Emily flinched at her mother's tone. She began backing away slowly, her small feet shuffling against the linoleum. But as she retreated, I noticed something that made my heart skip. Her iPad was still raised. The screen was facing toward the room, and in the upper corner, barely visible from my angle, a small red dot was blinking. She was recording. I did not know if she understood what she was capturing. I did not know if she had done this deliberately or if it was simply the habit Dr. Rourke had mentioned, a child's instinct to document her world through the lens of technology. But in that moment, as my 9-year-old granddaughter disappeared down the hospital corridor with her iPad still clutched protectively against her chest, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Hope. Lydia turned back to me, her composure restored. "We'll finish this conversation later, Robert." When there are fewer interruptions, she gathered her documents and left without another word. I watched the empty doorway for a long time after she was gone. Emily was just a child, innocent and small and easily overlooked. But sometimes, I thought, the most powerful witnesses are the ones nobody notices. The hospital grew quiet as evening settled over the building. Visiting hours ended at 8, and the steady stream of footsteps in the corridor gradually faded to occasional soft shuffles of nurses making their rounds. My dinner tray sat untouched on the rolling table. I had no appetite. My mind was too full of calculations, too occupied with the machinery of what was finally being set into motion. I waited until the hallway outside my room fell completely silent. The clock on the wall showed 9:30. The night nurse had checked my vitals 20 minutes ago and would not return for another hour. I was alone in the dim glow of the monitoring equipment, surrounded by shadows and the steady rhythm of my own breathing. Slowly, I reached toward the bedside drawer. The notebook was exactly where I had left it, tucked beneath a box of tissues and a paperback novel I had brought from home but never opened. It was small, perhaps 5 inches by 7, bound in brown leather that had grown soft and worn from years of handling. The edges of the pages were slightly yellowed, the spine creased from countless openings and closings. To anyone who glanced at it casually, it would appear to be nothing more than an old man's journal, unremarkable and easily dismissed. They would be wrong. I opened the cover and began turning pages, each one filled with my careful handwriting. Dates and times marched down the margins in neat columns. Descriptions followed in precise, clinical language, the voice of an engineer documenting structural failures. March 15, 2 years ago. Lydia called me a worthless burden during dinner. Said I was eating their food and contributing nothing. Mark sat across the table and said nothing. Did not meet my eyes. April 22. Lydia demanded I add her name to my bank accounts for convenience. I declined. She did not speak to me for 6 days. July 3. Pressured to sign household expense document. Language was vague. I signed but kept a photocopy hidden in my desk. Later review suggested it was attempt to establish financial control. September 8. Overheard Lydia telling Mark that I should be moved to a nursing home, that the house would be better used by them. Mark said he would think about it. November 30. Lydia took my car keys, said I was too old to drive safely. Returned them only after I agreed to give her access to my credit card for emergencies. The entries continued, page after page, month after month. Every slight documented. Every manipulation recorded. Every threat preserved in ink that would not fade, in handwriting that remained steady despite my age. I had been building this case for 2 years, one careful notation at a time, and Lydia had never suspected a thing. She thought I was a confused old man, too addled by grief and age to understand what was happening around me. She thought my silence meant submission, my patience meant weakness. She had no idea that every word she spoke in my presence was being catalogued, that every scheme she attempted was being added to a record that would one day be her undoing. I turned to a page near the middle of the notebook and paused. The handwriting here was different, shakier, written during a time when my hands trembled not from age but from grief. The entry was dated 3 years ago, just days before Elaine passed. Elaine spoke to me tonight about Lydia. She is worried. She says she has seen the way Lydia looks at our home, our savings, our life together. She says Lydia is waiting for her to die so she can begin taking everything. I told Elaine she was being paranoid. I told her that Lydia was difficult but not dangerous. Elaine squeezed my hand and looked at me with those eyes that always saw more than I wanted her to see. She said I was too trusting. She said my kindness would be used against me. She made me promise to write everything down. Every insult, every threat, every attempt to control or manipulate. She said not to confront Lydia until I had proof, until the record was complete and undeniable. She said she would prepare the rest. I did not understand what she meant then. I thought it was the morphine talking, the fog of pain and approaching death clouding her thoughts. But Elaine had never been clearer in her life. She spent her final weeks not saying goodbye but building fortifications, constructing defenses I would only discover years later when I needed them most. Dr. Rourke, Grace Whitmore. The codicil I did not yet know existed, all of it arranged by a dying woman who loved me enough to protect me from beyond the grave. I turned to the next blank page and picked up the pen I kept tucked in the notebook's spine. The date went first, written in the upper left corner. Then the entry, composed with the same precision I had maintained for 2 years. Hospital admission due to respiratory distress. Lydia arrived with Mark. Accused me of faking illness to avoid signing documents. When I refused to comply, she removed my oxygen tube and watched me struggle to breathe. Witness present. Dr. Samuel Rourke, attending physician. Incident captured on video during active call with colleague. Additional witness possible. Emily, granddaughter. Present in hallway with recording device. I read the entry twice, ensuring every detail was accurate. Then I closed the notebook and held it against my chest, feeling the weight of 2 years of patience pressing against my heart. The room was dark now, the city lights beyond the window casting faint patterns across the ceiling. I was alone, but I did not feel lonely. Elaine was with me in these pages, in every word I had written, in every instruction she had given me before death stole her away. I whispered into my love, The time has finally come. The doctors discharged me 2 days later with instructions to rest and a prescription for medication I would likely never take. Dr. Rourke walked me to the hospital entrance himself, a gesture that went beyond professional courtesy. At the curb, he shook my hand and held it for a moment longer than necessary. "Grace Whitmore will contact you soon," he said quietly. "Be ready for what she has to show you." I nodded and climbed into the taxi waiting to take me home. Not to Mark's house, where Lydia presided over every room like a watchful predator, but to my own home, the house Elaine and I had built together, the house I had refused to leave despite Lydia's endless campaigns to relocate me somewhere more convenient for her plans. The familiar sight of my front porch, with its weathered rocking chairs and hanging ferns, brought a relief so profound it nearly brought tears to my eyes. I paid the driver and walked slowly up the path, breathing in the scent of the garden Elaine had planted years ago. The roses needed trimming, the hedges were overgrown, but it was mine, and I was still here to defend it. Grace Whitmore arrived the following afternoon. She was a woman in her early 60s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that missed nothing. Her handshake was firm, her manner direct, and within moments of meeting her I understood why Elaine had trusted her for a decade. "Mr. Hayes," she said, settling into the armchair across from me in the living room, "I've been waiting for this meeting for 3 years. I had hoped it would never be necessary, but your wife was not a woman who left anything to chance." She placed a leather briefcase on the coffee table between us and opened it with practiced efficiency. Inside were several folders, each one labeled and organized with the precision of someone accustomed to building airtight cases. "Elaine came to me 6 months before she passed," Grace continued. "She was already quite ill, but her mind was as sharp as ever. She told me she was worried about you, about what would happen after she was gone. She never mentioned any of this to me," I said. "She didn't want to burden you with her suspicions. She wanted your final months together to be peaceful, not consumed by conflict." Grace pulled a thick folder from the briefcase and placed it on the table, but she also refused to leave you unprotected. So she hired a private investigator. I stared at the folder. It was perhaps 2 inches thick, filled with documents and photographs I could not yet see. To investigate Lydia, to investigate everything about Lydia, Grace opened the folder and began spreading its contents across the table. What she found was disturbing, Mr. Hayes. "Your daughter-in-law is not simply a difficult woman. She is a predator with a documented history." The first document was a marriage certificate from Florida, dated 12 years ago. The groom's name was Derek Lawson. The bride's name was Lydia Marie Lawson, née Patterson. Lydia was married before Mark? I had never known this. She had never mentioned any previous marriage, and Mark had certainly never spoken of it. "For 4 years, Grace confirmed. "The marriage ended in divorce 8 years ago. The circumstances were not pleasant." She slid another document toward me, a police report with portions highlighted in yellow. Derek Lawson's mother was 73 years old when Lydia moved into their home. Within 2 years, the elderly woman had filed a complaint alleging verbal abuse, financial manipulation, and on one occasion, physical intimidation. I read the highlighted sections with growing horror. The language was clinical, detached, but the picture it painted was unmistakable. Lydia had isolated Derek's mother from her friends, controlled her access to money, and subjected her to constant psychological torment. The pattern was identical to what I had experienced over the past 2 years. "What happened to the complaint?" I asked. "The family withdrew it." Grace's voice was carefully neutral. According to the investigator's notes, Derek's mother was terrified of retaliation. She recanted her statement and refused to cooperate further. The case was closed without charges. But the records still exist. They do. They remain in the Florida system, accessible to anyone who knows where to look. Grace gathered the documents and returned them to the folder. "Your wife found them, Mr. Hayes. She saw the pattern before anyone else did, and she made preparations." She reached into the briefcase again and withdrew a sealed envelope, cream-colored and slightly yellowed with age. My name was written across the front in Elaine's handwriting, the familiar loops and curves that I would recognize anywhere. "This is the second envelope Elaine left with me," Grace said. "The first contained instructions and the investigator's file. This one contains something else, something she specified could only be opened when there was concrete evidence of abuse against you." My hand trembled as I reached for the envelope. "And now there is evidence. Now there is video evidence, eyewitness testimony from a physician, and a documented pattern of prior behavior." Grace placed the envelope in my hands with the gravity of someone delivering a sacred trust. Elaine knew exactly who your daughter-in-law was, and she spent her final months making sure you would never be defenseless. The envelope felt heavier than paper and ink should weigh. I held it in my hands for a long moment, staring at Elaine's handwriting, tracing the familiar curves of my name with eyes that had grown blurry with age and emotion. Grace sat quietly across from me, giving me the space to absorb what was happening. She understood, I think, that some moments require silence to be properly felt. Finally, I broke the seal. Inside were 2 items. The first was a legal document, several pages bound together with a small clip. The second was a single sheet of stationery, folded once, covered in the handwriting I would recognize until the day I died. I began with the legal document. The heading identified it as a codicil, a formal amendment to a last will and testament. The language was dense with legal terminology, but Grace had prepared me for this, and I read through it carefully, absorbing each clause and condition. The core provision was devastating in its simplicity. If there is proven evidence of abuse, whether physical, psychological, or financial, against Robert Hayes by any party connected to beneficiaries of this estate, the inheritance share designated for that beneficiary shall be immediately and irrevocably revoked. Said share shall be transferred in its entirety to the Elaine Hayes Charitable Foundation to be used for the support of elderly abuse victims and their families. I read the paragraph twice, then a third time. The implications were staggering. Lydia had spent years maneuvering to gain control of our assets through Mark. She had assumed that once Elaine was gone, there would be no obstacles remaining. She had never imagined that Elaine would build a tripwire into her own will, a mechanism designed to activate the moment Lydia's true nature was exposed. The signatures at the bottom of the document confirmed its legitimacy. Elaine's signature came first, slightly shaky but unmistakably hers, written during those final months when her strength was fading but her resolve remained iron. Below it was Grace Whitmore's notary seal and signature, and beneath those were 2 witness signatures that made my breath catch. Dr. Samuel Rourke, James Turner. James was my oldest friend, a man I had known since our college days at Texas A&M. We had drifted apart somewhat in recent years, as old friends often do, but apparently Elaine had reached out to him without my knowledge. She had assembled allies from every corner of my life, people she trusted to stand by me when she no longer could. I set the codicil aside and unfolded the letter. The paper smelled faintly of the lavender perfume Elaine had worn for 40 years. I closed my eyes and breathed it in, allowing myself one moment of pure memory before reading her final words to me. "My dearest Robert," she had written, "if you are reading this, then my worst fears have been realized. I prayed that I was wrong about Lydia, that my suspicions were nothing more than the paranoia of a dying woman. But I know what I saw in her eyes, and I know the pattern of her behavior. She is waiting for me to die so she can begin taking everything we built together. I know you, my love. I know you better than you know yourself. You will not fight for your own sake. You will make excuses for her cruelty. You will absorb her abuse in silence because you believe that keeping the peace is more important than protecting yourself. But you are wrong. You deserve protection. You deserve dignity. You deserve to live your remaining years in peace, surrounded by people who genuinely love you. So I am fighting for you, even though I will not be there to see the battle. Forgive my presumption. Forgive me for making decisions without consulting you. But I would rather be wrong about Lydia and have this codicil sit unused forever than leave you defenseless against a predator. Everything is in place. Grace has her instructions. Dr. Rourke has his. James will stand with you when you need him. All that remains is for you to find the courage to use what I have given you. You are stronger than you believe, Robert. You have always been strong. You simply needed someone to remind you. I love you. I will always love you. And I will be watching over you somehow until we meet again. Forever yours, Elaine. The letter trembled in my hands. My vision blurred completely as tears I had been holding back for 3 years finally broke through. They streamed down my weathered face, dropping onto my shirt, onto the letter, onto the codicil that represented my wife's final act of love. She had known. She had always known. And while cancer ravaged her body, while death approached with terrible certainty, she had spent her remaining strength not on goodbyes but on fortifications. She had built an entire system of protection around me, a fortress constructed from legal documents and trusted allies, and a love so fierce it refused to die, even when she did. I pressed the letter against my chest and wept openly, no longer caring what Grace might think. These were not tears of grief, not entirely. They were tears of gratitude, of wonder, of love that transcended the boundary between life and death. "You didn't presume, my love," I whispered to the empty air, knowing somehow that she could hear me. "You simply knew me better than I knew myself." Grace left shortly after I composed myself, promising to return the following day to discuss next steps. She took the codicil with her for safekeeping, but I kept Elaine's letter. I could not bear to let it out of my sight. That night, I slept with it on the pillow beside me, as if her words could protect me even in dreams. 3 days passed in relative peace. I spent them quietly, reading through my notebook, organizing the evidence I had accumulated, and speaking occasionally with Grace by telephone. I knew the calm would not last. Lydia was not the type to accept silence. She would come eventually, and I needed to be ready. She arrived on the 4th day. I heard her car pull into the driveway before I saw it, the aggressive rumble of her SUV announcing her presence like a warning. I was sitting in the living room with a cup of tea, deliberately positioned where I could see the front door. I had learned over the years that it was better to face Lydia directly than to be caught off guard. The door opened without a knock. She walked in as if she owned the place, her heels clicking against the hardwood floors Elaine and I had installed ourselves 30 years ago. Emily followed behind her mother, small and quiet, clutching her iPad against her chest as she always did. "Robert," Lydia said, her voice carrying that false sweetness I had come to recognize as a prelude to demands. "I heard you discharged yourself from the hospital. You should have called us." Mark was worried. "I am fine," I said evenly. "The doctors cleared me to return home. This home." She glanced around the living room with barely concealed calculation. "You know, it's really too big for one person. All these stairs, all this maintenance, it must be exhausting for someone your age." I said nothing. I had learned that responding to her provocations only gave her ammunition. She moved through the room, trailing her fingers along the furniture, examining photographs on the mantel. "We should discuss the future, Robert. Practical arrangements. I have some ideas that would benefit everyone." "I am sure you do." Something flickered in her eyes at my tone, but she did not pursue it. Instead, she excused herself to use the bathroom, disappearing down the hallway with the confident stride of someone who believed she controlled every situation she entered. The moment she was gone, Emily moved. The child crossed the room with surprising speed, her small feet barely making a sound on the floor. She stopped in front of my chair, trembling visibly, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination that seemed far too mature for her 9 years. "Grandpa," she whispered urgently, "I have something. I have to show you before Mommy comes back." She thrust the iPad toward me with shaking hands. The screen was already illuminated, displaying a folder filled with video files, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, each one labeled with a date and a brief description written in a child's careful lettering. "What is this, sweetheart?" I asked, though some part of me already knew. "Videos," Emily said, her voice barely audible, "of Mommy. When she's mean to you." I began scrolling through the folder, my heart pounding harder with each title I read. March 12, Mommy yelling at Grandpa about money. April 5, Mommy calling Grandpa worthless. May 18, Mommy making Grandpa sign papers. The dates stretched back 6 months, covering a period of abuse I had meticulously documented in my own notebook, but never imagined anyone else had witnessed. I opened one of the videos at random. The footage was shaky, filmed from an angle that suggested Emily had been hiding around a corner or behind furniture, but the audio was clear. Lydia's voice filled the room, sharp and cruel, berating me for being slow, for being useless, for being a burden on everyone around me. I watched myself on the screen, sitting silently, absorbing her abuse with the practiced patience of a man who had learned that resistance only made things worse. "There's more," Emily whispered. She reached over and scrolled to a video near the end of the folder. The label read "Hospital, Mommy and the Tube." I pressed play. The footage showed a hospital doorway, filmed from the hallway outside. Through the gap, I could see myself lying in the bed, Lydia standing over me. The audio captured every word of her accusation, every syllable of her threat. And then, with terrible clarity, it captured the moment she yanked the oxygen tube from my face. I stopped the video. My hands were shaking. "Why?" I managed to ask. "Emily, why did you do this?" Tears spilled down her small cheeks. Before Grandma went to heaven, she told me something. She said, "If anyone ever hurts Grandpa, you tell him. You make sure he knows." I didn't understand what she meant, but then Mommy started being so mean to you, and I didn't know how to tell you, so I just... She hiccuped through her sobs. "I just recorded everything. So you would believe me." The weight of what she had done crashed over me like a wave. This child, this innocent 9-year-old girl, had been carrying the burden of witnessing her mother's cruelty for 6 months. She had watched and recorded and kept silent, all because her dying grandmother had planted a seed of protection that bloomed in ways none of us could have predicted. I pulled Emily into my arms and held her tightly, feeling her small body shake with the release of emotions she had been suppressing for far too long. My own tears fell freely, dropping into her hair as I rocked her gently. Elaine's protection extended even further than I had imagined. She had not only prepared allies and legal documents, she had prepared our granddaughter to bear witness. "You did perfectly, sweetheart," I whispered into her hair. "Grandma would be so proud of you." I kept Emily's iPad hidden in my study, locked in a drawer whose key never left my pocket. The child had carried her burden alone for too long. Now it was my turn to protect what she had gathered. I copied every video to a secure flash drive that Grace Whitmore collected the following morning, her expression growing grimmer with each file she reviewed. "This changes everything," she said before leaving. "We have enough now to move forward. I'll begin preparing the documentation." A week passed. I installed security cameras throughout my home, small devices positioned discreetly in corners and doorways. Grace had recommended this precaution, and a technician she trusted completed the work in a single afternoon. The cameras fed to a secure server that Grace could access remotely. Every room was covered, every angle was captured. If Lydia came again, there would be no ambiguity about what occurred. I did not have to wait long. The attack came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was reading in the living room when I heard tires screech in the driveway, followed by the violent slam of a car door. Footsteps pounded up the porch stairs. The front door flew open with such force that it struck the wall behind it, leaving a dent in the plaster. Lydia stood in the doorway, her face contorted with fury. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving, her eyes wild with a rage I had never seen so nakedly displayed. "You think you're clever," she spat, storming into the room. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" I remained seated, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "I don't know what you're talking about, Lydia." "Don't lie to me." She advanced toward my chair, each step deliberate and menacing. "Mark told me. He let it slip that you've been talking to some lawyer, Grace Whitmore. What are you plotting with her, old man? What lies are you spreading about me?" "Mark." My son had accidentally revealed my communications with Grace. I felt a pang of disappointment, but not surprise. Mark had never been able to keep anything from Lydia. She had trained him too well. "I have a right to consult an attorney," I said calmly. "That is not a crime." "A right?" She laughed, a harsh and ugly sound. "You have no rights in this family. You're a burden. A useless, senile burden that everyone has to carry. And now you're going behind our backs, talking to lawyers, trying to turn people against me." She was standing directly over me now, close enough that I could see the veins pulsing in her temples. Her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. "What are you planning?" she demanded. "Tell me right now, or I swear to God, I owe you no explanations." The words were barely out of my mouth before her hand shot forward. She grabbed my shoulder and shoved, hard. The force of it toppled me from my chair. I hit the floor awkwardly, my hip striking the hardwood with a burst of pain that radiated through my entire body. My phone clattered from my pocket and skidded across the floor. Lydia snatched it up before I could react. "What's on here?" she hissed, scrolling through the screen. "Messages? Evidence? What have you been sending to that lawyer?" "Give that back," I said, struggling to push myself upright. She ignored me. When she found nothing incriminating on the visible screen, her frustration boiled over. She raised the phone above her head and hurled it against the wall with all her strength. The device shattered on impact, pieces of glass and metal scattering across the floor like shrapnel. "There," she said, her voice trembling with adrenaline. "Now try calling your precious lawyer." The front door opened again. Mark rushed in, his face pale with horror. He must have followed Lydia from their home, arriving moments too late to prevent what had already happened. "Lydia, stop! He grabbed her arm and pulled her back from where I lay on the floor. "What are you doing? Have you lost your mind?" She struggled against his grip, still glaring at me with undisguised hatred. Mark held her firmly, but his eyes were fixed on me. In them I saw something I had not seen in years: anguish, shame, a silent plea for forgiveness that he could not bring himself to speak aloud. My son knew. He had always known what his wife was, and the weight of his complicity was finally becoming too heavy to bear. "Get off me," Lydia snarled, wrenching free from Mark's grasp. She straightened her clothes and smoothed her hair, attempting to reassemble her composure. "This isn't over, Robert. You think you can fight me? You're old and alone, and nobody will believe a word you say." She turned and stormed toward the door. Just before she crossed the threshold, she looked back one final time. "I'll put you in a nursing home," she screamed. "I'll have you declared incompetent. You'll have nothing. Nothing." She was gone before I could respond, her footsteps fading down the porch stairs. I remained on the floor for a long moment, catching my breath. Then, slowly, I became aware of another presence. Emily stood just outside the living room doorway, her iPad raised in both hands, the screen facing toward where the confrontation had occurred. Her small face was streaked with tears, but her hands were steady. She had recorded everything. Again, I pulled myself upright, ignoring the throbbing in my hip. I touched my lip and my fingers came away red. Lydia's shove had been harder than I realized, but my hands were steady. My voice was calm. "No, Lydia," I said quietly, though she was already gone. "You are the one who will have nothing." The bruise on my hip took 2 weeks to fade from purple to yellow. The cut on my lip healed faster, leaving only a faint line that would eventually disappear entirely. But the evidence of what Lydia had done would endure far longer than any physical mark. It was preserved in high definition on security cameras, on Emily's iPad, and now in the formal complaint that Grace Whitmore filed with Texas Adult Protective Services. I sat in Grace's office the morning she submitted the documentation, watching her organize the evidence into neat folders that would become the foundation of an official investigation. The collection was substantial. Dr. Rourke's video from the hospital, capturing the moment Lydia yanked my breathing tube. Emily's recording spanning 6 months of verbal abuse and intimidation. Security camera footage showing Lydia shoving me to the floor and destroying my phone. Medical reports from Methodist Hospital documenting my respiratory distress and subsequent injuries. "This is one of the most comprehensive cases I've ever assembled," Grace said, sealing the final envelope. "APS will have no choice but to investigate thoroughly." The Texas Adult Protective Services Office received our complaint 3 days later. Within a week, an investigator named Patricia Vance contacted me to schedule an interview. She was a serious woman in her 40s, with the careful demeanor of someone accustomed to navigating volatile family situations. I answered her questions honestly and completely, holding nothing back. I had spent 2 years documenting Lydia's behavior precisely for this moment. Lydia was notified of the investigation shortly afterward. I learned this not from official channels but from Mark, who called me late one evening with panic threading through his voice. "Dad, what have you done?" he asked. "Lydia received a letter from some government agency. She's furious. She says you're trying to destroy her." "I am trying to protect myself," I replied calmly. "There is a difference." Mark was silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, more uncertain. "She's hired a lawyer. She says she's going to prove you're mentally unstable, that everything you've claimed is the delusion of a senile old man. Let her try." I ended the call without further discussion. Lydia could hire all the lawyers she wanted. The evidence spoke for itself. 2 weeks into the investigation, Grace called me with news that shifted the entire landscape of our case. "I've been doing some additional research," she said, her voice carrying an edge of controlled excitement. "The private investigator Elaine hired found records of Lydia's previous marriage in Florida, but I wanted to dig deeper. I requested access to the national database of elder abuse reports." I gripped the phone tighter. "And Lydia was reported to Florida's Adult Protective Services 8 years ago. The complaint was filed by a neighbor who witnessed her screaming at Derek Lawson's elderly mother. The neighbor described behavior almost identical to what you've experienced. Verbal degradation, financial control, isolation from friends and family." My chest tightened. I had known about the previous marriage and its ugly end, but seeing the pattern confirmed in official records made it terrifyingly real. Lydia was not simply a difficult person who had targeted me specifically. She was a predator who had done this before, who had refined her techniques over years, who had escaped consequences only because her previous victim had been too frightened to pursue justice. What happened to the Florida case, I asked. The victim's family withdrew their complaint. According to the notes, they cited fear of retaliation. Without their cooperation, the case was closed. Grace paused, but the records were never expunged. They still exist in the system, and I've obtained copies. This establishes a documented pattern of behavior that will be extremely difficult for Lydia to explain away. I exhaled slowly, absorbing the implications. Lydia had done this before. She had abused another elderly person, escaped without consequences, and then moved on to find new victims. My son, my family, me. There's something else, Grace continued. During my review of the financial documents connected to the Florida case, I noticed an anomaly. Lydia has been making monthly transfers to an individual whose name I don't recognize. The payments started approximately 6 months after her divorce from Derek Lawson and have continued without interruption ever since. Who is she paying? I don't know yet. The account is registered to a man named Derek Lawson himself, but the amounts are too consistent to be random. It looks like some kind of regular payment, almost like. She trailed off, considering. Almost like hush money or blackmail. The revelation opened new questions that spiraled in directions I had not anticipated. Lydia had been paying her ex-husband for years. Why? What did Derek Lawson know that was worth such sustained investment? And what would happen if those payments stopped? Someone is helping her, Grace said slowly. Studying the records spread across her desk, I could hear the rustle of papers through the phone, the soft tap of her pen against the wooden surface, or perhaps someone is controlling her. Either way, we need to find out who. Grace's discovery about the mysterious payments lingered in my mind for days. But before we could pursue that thread further, she reminded me of something I had been postponing since the investigation began. Elaine's safety deposit box at First National Bank remained unopened. Grace had mentioned it weeks ago when she first explained the scope of my wife's preparations, but the emotional weight of accessing it had kept me away. There may be additional materials inside, Grace said gently during our last meeting. Elaine was thorough. If she left something in that box, it was for a reason. I drove to the bank on a gray Thursday morning, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain but never delivered. The branch manager recognized my name immediately and escorted me personally to the vault, a courtesy extended to longtime customers. Elaine and I had banked here for over 30 years. The staff had sent flowers to her funeral. The box was smaller than I expected, perhaps 6 inches wide and 12 inches long. I carried it to a private viewing room and sat alone at the polished table, staring at the metal container as if it might contain something dangerous. In a way, I suppose it did. It contained the past, and the past has a power that can wound as easily as heal. Inside the box, I found 3 items. A folder of financial documents that appeared to be copies of records I already possessed. A sealed envelope addressed to Grace Whitmore, which I set aside to deliver later. And a USB drive, small and silver, with a date written on its surface in Elaine's handwriting. The date was 3 weeks before she died. I returned home and sat in my study for nearly an hour before I found the courage to insert the drive into my laptop. The folder that appeared contained a single video file. I clicked it open with trembling fingers. Elaine's face filled the screen. She was sitting in her hospital bed, propped against pillows that seemed to swallow her diminished frame. The cancer had stolen so much from her by then. Her cheeks were hollow, her skin pale and paper-thin, her beautiful silver hair reduced to wisps beneath a soft cap, but her eyes remained exactly as I remembered them, sharp, determined, alive with an intelligence that illness could not diminish. "Robert," she said, and even through the speakers, her voice wrapped around me like an embrace. "If you're watching this, it means what I feared has happened. It means Lydia has finally shown her true nature, and you've been forced to defend yourself against her." She paused, and I watched her gather strength for what came next. Even recording this message had cost her energy she could not spare. "I want you to understand why I did what I did. Why I spent my final months preparing instead of simply saying goodbye." She looked directly into the camera, directly at me, across the gulf of 3 years and death itself. I saw how Lydia looked at our home, our savings, our life together. She looked at everything we built the way a predator measures prey, calculating, patient, waiting for the moment of weakness when she could strike. Tears were sliding down my cheeks, but I could not look away. I owed her this. I owed her my complete attention. I knew you wouldn't see it, Elaine continued. You always want to believe the best in people, Robert. It's one of the things I love most about you, and one of the things that terrifies me most about leaving you behind. You would make excuses for her. You would absorb her cruelty in silence, convincing yourself that keeping peace was more important than protecting yourself. She shook her head slowly, and even that small motion seemed to exhaust her. But I couldn't leave you unprotected. I couldn't go peacefully into whatever comes next, knowing that woman would tear you apart the moment I was gone. So I prepared. The codicil, the investigator, Dr. Rourke, Grace. Everything you need to fight back is already in place. All you need now is courage to use it. Her expression softened, and I saw tears glistening in her eyes to match my own. Don't forgive cruelty, Robert. I know you think forgiveness is always the higher path, but you're wrong. Forgiving someone who continues to harm you isn't kindness, it's surrender. It's giving them permission to destroy you. And I will not allow that, not even from the grave. She leaned closer to the camera, and for a moment it felt as though she could see me, as though the barrier of time and death had dissolved. I love you. I have loved you since the day we met, and I will love you long after this body turns to dust. But you need to live now. Not for me, for yourself. You deserve peace. You deserve dignity. You deserve to spend whatever years remain surrounded by people who genuinely love you. She smiled then, a smile so full of love and sorrow that it shattered something inside me. Goodbye, my darling. Fight well, and know that I am watching over you somehow, always. The video ended. The screen went dark. I sat alone in the silence of my study and wept. I wept for the wife I had lost, for the love that had transcended death, for the preparations she had made while her own life slipped away. I wept until there were no tears left, until the grief transformed into something harder and more resolute. Then I dried my eyes and stood. I won't let you down, my love. The call came 2 days after I watched Elaine's video. I was sitting in my study, reviewing the documents Grace had assembled, when my phone rang with an unfamiliar number. I almost let it go to voicemail, assuming it was another telemarketer or scam call. Something made me answer anyway. Dad. Mark's voice was barely a whisper, strained and urgent. I need to see you. Alone, please. I had not spoken to my son since his panicked call warning me about Lydia's lawyer. The silence between us had stretched for weeks, filled with everything neither of us knew how to say. But there was something in his voice. Desperation, yes, but also something that sounded almost like hope. When? I asked. Today. This afternoon. There's a park near your house, the one with the old bandstand where Mom and I used to feed the ducks. He paused, and I heard him swallow hard. Can you meet me there at 3 o'clock? Don't tell anyone, especially not your lawyer. Not yet, I agreed, though every instinct told me this could be another of Lydia's manipulations. Perhaps she had sent Mark to gather information, to find weaknesses in my case that her own attorney could exploit. But the tremor in my son's voice had sounded genuine, and despite everything, he was still my son. I had to give him the chance to explain. The park was nearly empty when I arrived, the autumn chill keeping most visitors away. I found Mark sitting on a bench near the old bandstand, hunched forward with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands. He looked up when he heard my footsteps on the gravel path, and what I saw made my heart clench with concern. He looked like a man who had not slept in weeks. Dark circles shadowed his eyes. His skin had a grayish pallor that spoke of stress and exhaustion. He had lost weight since I last saw him, his clothes hanging loose on a frame that had always been slender but now seemed almost fragile. Dad. He stood as I approached, then seemed uncertain whether to embrace me or maintain distance. He settled for an awkward step forward that went nowhere. Thank you for coming. I sat down on the bench and waited. Whatever he needed to say, he would say it in his own time. Mark sat beside me, staring at the ground. His hands were trembling visibly, and he clasped them together as if trying to hold himself in one piece. I know what Lydia has been doing to you, he said finally. The words came out hoarse, scraped raw by emotions he could no longer contain. I've known from the beginning. My heart sank. Some part of me had always suspected this, had always wondered how my son could stand by while his wife tormented his father. But hearing him confirm it aloud was a different kind of pain, sharper and more personal than anything Lydia had inflicted. Why? The question was all I could manage. Mark's face crumpled. She threatened me, Dad. She said if I ever tried to stop her or take your side, she would claim I was abusive. She said she had evidence, photographs, and documents that would prove I hurt her and Emily. She said she would take my daughter away and make sure I never saw her again. He pulled a folder from inside his jacket and placed it on the bench between us. His hands were shaking so badly that he nearly dropped it twice. The evidence is fake, all of it. She staged photographs of bruises she gave herself. She wrote diary entries describing abuse that never happened. She has been building a case against me for years, keeping it ready as insurance in case I ever stepped out of line. I opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of documents I recognized immediately. The insurance papers Lydia had tried to make me sign, the property transfer authorizations, the financial forms, but there were also papers I had never seen before, documents bearing my signature in handwriting that was close to mine but not quite right. Forgeries. Lydia had been forging my signature on documents I had never agreed to sign. I kept copies of everything, Mark said, his voice breaking. Every document she brought to you, every paper she made you sign or tried to make you sign, I duplicated in secret. I knew someday there might be a reckoning, and I wanted proof of what she had done. He turned to face me, tears streaming down his cheeks. I was a coward, Dad. I chose silence because I was terrified of losing Emily. But in protecting my daughter, I abandoned my father. I let you suffer alone when I should have stood beside you. His voice shattered completely. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. The anger I expected to feel did not come. Looking at my son, at the wreckage Lydia had made of him, I felt only a profound and weary sadness. She had manipulated us both, isolating each of us with threats tailored to our deepest fears. Mark had been as much her prisoner as I had been her victim. I placed my hand on his shoulder. He flinched at the touch, as if expecting a blow instead of comfort. You were wrong to stay silent, I said quietly. That choice caused more damage than you may ever fully understand. But you are here now. You are telling me the truth. That is the first step back toward being the man your mother believed you could be. Mark looked up at me, his eyes red and swollen, his face a mask of desperate hope. I'll testify against her, Dad. I'll tell the investigators everything. I'll give them all the documents, all the evidence of what she's done. He gripped my arm with sudden intensity. Even if I lose everything, even if she takes Emily, I can't live like this anymore. The days following Mark's confession moved with the deliberate pace of a gathering storm. Grace worked around the clock to incorporate his evidence into our case, while I spent long hours preparing myself for what was to come. The formal reading of Elaine's will had been scheduled for weeks, delayed repeatedly by legal maneuverings from Lydia's attorney. But now all obstacles had been cleared, all postponements exhausted. The moment of reckoning had finally arrived. Grace's office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian building in downtown Houston. The conference room where we gathered was elegant and imposing, with dark wood paneling and tall windows that overlooked the city streets below. A long mahogany table dominated the center of the space, surrounded by leather chairs that seemed designed to make their occupants feel simultaneously important and small. I arrived early with Mark, who had barely spoken during the drive. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, his jaw set with the grim determination of a man walking toward his own execution. He had chosen his side, and there was no turning back. Dr. Samuel Rourke was already seated when we entered, his silver hair neatly combed and his expression professionally neutral. Beside him sat James Turner, my oldest friend, a man I had known since before Mark was born. James caught my eye and gave a small nod of solidarity. He had been one of the witnesses to Elaine's codicil, recruited during her final weeks without my knowledge. Another piece of her intricate plan falling into place. Grace stood at the head of the table, arranging documents with the methodical precision that characterized everything she did. A large screen had been mounted on the wall behind her, currently dark but connected to a laptop that sat open on the table. The door opened, and Lydia swept into the room. She was dressed as if for a celebration, wearing a tailored designer suit in deep burgundy and jewelry that glittered under the conference room lights. Her hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, her posture radiating confidence. She looked at me with a small, triumphant smile, then took her seat at the opposite end of the table, without acknowledging anyone else in the room. She believed she had won. The certainty was written across every line of her face. Now that everyone is present, Grace began, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We can proceed with the formal reading of the last will and testament of Elaine Margaret Hayes." She opened a leather folder and withdrew a document several pages thick. The original will, the one Elaine had drafted years before her diagnosis, when the future seemed infinite and betrayal was unimaginable. "The primary provisions are straightforward," Grace continued. Mrs. Hayes designated her husband, Robert Hayes, as the principal beneficiary of her estate. Secondary provisions allocated a portion of assets to her son, Mark Hayes, to be held in trust until certain conditions were met. Lydia's smile widened. As Mark's wife, she would have access to whatever he inherited. She had been counting on this moment for years, waiting with predatory patience for the wealth she believed was rightfully hers. "However," Grace said, pausing to remove a second document from the folder, "there is an additional instrument that must be considered. A codicil, signed and notarized 3 months after the original will." The smile froze on Lydia's face. "What codicil?" Her voice was sharp, all pretense of composure evaporating. "No one said anything about a codicil. This is the first I'm hearing of this." "The codicil was executed privately, in accordance with Mrs. Hayes's wishes." Grace's tone remained perfectly level. "It amends the original will under specific circumstances. This is absurd." Lydia turned to her attorney, a slender man in an expensive suit who sat beside her looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Do something. Object." "This document was never disclosed during discovery." "The codicil was sealed," Grace replied calmly, "to be opened only upon evidence of conditions specified within its terms. Those conditions have now been met." Dr. Rourke rose from his chair. "I am one of 2 witnesses who signed that document," he said, his physician's voice carrying the weight of unimpeachable authority. "I was present when Mrs. Hayes executed the amendment, and I can attest to her complete mental competency at the time of signing." James Turner nodded slowly. "I am the second witness. Elaine asked me to be there because she trusted me to speak the truth when the time came." He looked directly at Lydia. "That time has come." Lydia's face had gone pale. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed genuinely afraid. "Before reading the codicil," Grace continued, moving toward the laptop on the table, "the terms require presentation of relevant evidence. This evidence has been compiled from multiple sources and verified for authenticity." She pressed a key, and the screen behind her flickered to life. The image that appeared was a hospital room. My hospital room, filmed from the doorway during Dr. Rourke's video call with his colleague. In the frame, Lydia stood over my bed, her face contorted with rage. The audio captured every word of her accusation, every syllable of her contempt. And then, with terrible clarity, she reached down and yanked the oxygen tube from my face. Lydia's scream of denial echoed through the conference room, raw and desperate. But the video continued to play. The video of the breathing tube incident ended, but Grace did not pause. She advanced to the next file with the calm efficiency of a prosecutor who had built an airtight case and intended to present every piece of it. "The hospital footage represents only the beginning of the documented abuse," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. "What follows is a compilation of recordings made over a 6-month period by a witness who observed the defendant's behavior firsthand." The screen filled with a new video. Emily's shaky footage showed Lydia standing over me in my own living room, her face twisted with contempt as she called me worthless, useless, a burden that everyone was tired of carrying. Another clip followed, then another, each one capturing a different instance of verbal assault and psychological torment. The timestamps in the corner of the screen told their own story, documenting a pattern of abuse that stretched across months. Lydia's attorney leaned over to whisper urgently in her ear, but she pushed him away. Her composure had shattered completely now. She sat rigid in her chair, her manicured nails digging into the leather armrests, her eyes fixed on the screen with an expression that flickered between fury and fear. "These recordings were supplemented by security camera footage from Mr. Hayes's residence," Grace continued. She clicked to another file, and the screen showed Lydia storming into my home, shoving me to the floor, smashing my phone against the wall. The audio captured her threats with perfect clarity. "I'll put you in a nursing home. You'll have nothing. Additionally, we have obtained copies of documents bearing Mr. Hayes's forged signature." Grace held up the folder Mark had given me in the park. "These forgeries were created by the defendant in an attempt to gain unauthorized control of Mr. Hayes's assets." Handwriting analysis has confirmed that the signatures are not authentic. This is a conspiracy, Lydia hissed, her voice rising to a pitch that bordered on hysteria. You planned all of this. You've been working together to destroy me from the beginning. She looked around the room, seeking allies and finding none. Dr. Rourke regarded her with the clinical detachment of a physician observing a terminal case. James Turner's expression held nothing but contempt. Mark would not meet her eyes at all, his gaze fixed on the table in front of him. No one has conspired against you, Mrs. Hayes, Grace replied evenly. The evidence speaks for itself, but we are not yet finished. She clicked to another document, projecting it onto the screen. It was a police report from Florida, dated 8 years ago. 8 years before her marriage to Mark Hayes, the defendant was reported to Florida Adult Protective Services for abusing the elderly mother of her first husband. The complaint described a pattern of behavior remarkably similar to what Mr. Robert Hayes has endured. Verbal degradation, financial manipulation, isolation from family and friends, physical intimidation. Lydia's face went gray. That case was dismissed. The family withdrew their complaint. They withdrew out of fear, Grace said. But the records remain, and so does the witness. She pressed another key, and a new video appeared on the screen. This one showed a man in his late 40s, sitting in what appeared to be an attorney's office. He had dark hair streaked with gray and the weathered face of someone who had lived through difficult years. A nameplate on the desk in front of him read Derek Lawson. There is one more witness, Grace announced. The man you have been paying monthly to keep quiet. Derek Lawson looked directly into the camera and began to speak. My name is Derek Lawson. I was married to Lydia Patterson for 4 years, from 2012 to 2016. During that time, she systematically abused my mother, who was 73 years old and living with us due to health issues. His voice was steady but heavy with the weight of long-suppressed truth. Lydia isolated my mother from her friends. She controlled her access to money. She screamed at her daily, calling her a burden, telling her she was worthless and should have died years ago. On 3 occasions, she physically intimidated my mother, blocking doorways and grabbing her arms hard enough to leave bruises. He paused, and his jaw tightened. After our divorce, Lydia began paying me monthly to keep silent about what she had done. I accepted the money because I was ashamed and afraid, but I also kept evidence, photographs of my mother's bruises, medical records documenting her injuries, recordings I made when I suspected what was happening. Derek held up a thick folder, its contents visible through the transparent cover. I have carried this guilt for 8 years. When I learned that Lydia had done the same thing to another elderly victim, I knew I could not stay silent any longer. This ends now. The video froze on Derek's face, his expression resolute. Lydia spun toward the screen, her features twisted with disbelief and dawning horror. Derek, she breathed. You betrayed me? The room remained silent. No one moved. No one spoke in her defense. Then Mark rose slowly from his chair. He stood tall for the first time in months, his shoulders squared, his eyes finally meeting his wife's. No, Lydia, he said quietly. He just did what I should have done years ago. The silence that followed Mark's words seemed to stretch into eternity. Lydia stared at her husband with an expression I had never seen on her face before, a mixture of shock and betrayal that might have been almost pitiable if she had not spent years inflicting far worse on others. Her mouth opened and closed several times, but no words emerged. For once in her life, she had been rendered completely speechless. Grace allowed the moment to settle before continuing. She understood the power of silence, the way it could amplify the weight of what had already been said and what was still to come. Now that the evidence has been presented, she said, returning to the document spread before her, we may proceed with the reading of the codicil. She lifted the amendment to Elaine's will and began to read aloud, her voice clear and deliberate. I, Elaine Margaret Hayes, being of sound mind and under no duress, do hereby amend my last will and testament with the following provisions. If, at any time following my death, there exists proven evidence of abuse, whether physical, psychological, or financial, against my husband Robert Hayes, perpetrated by any party connected to beneficiaries of this estate, the following consequences shall apply. Grace paused, allowing the words to sink in before delivering the decisive clause. The inheritance share designated for my son, Mark Hayes, shall be permanently and irrevocably revoked. Said share, shall be transferred in its entirety to the Elaine Hayes Charitable Foundation, established for the purpose of supporting elderly abuse victims and their families. This revocation shall apply regardless of Mark Hayes' direct involvement in the abuse, as complicity through silence constitutes a failure of the moral responsibility I expect from my heir." Mark lowered his head. He had known this was coming, had accepted it as the price of his years of cowardice. But hearing the words spoken aloud, in his mother's voice channeled through her attorney, seemed to strike him with fresh force. His shoulders trembled slightly, though he made no sound. "The codicil further specifies," Grace continued, "that all remaining assets of the estate, including but not limited to real property, financial accounts, investment portfolios, and personal effects, shall pass solely and entirely to Robert Hayes, to be disposed of according to his wishes without restriction or condition." She set down the document and looked directly at Lydia. "To be clear, Mrs. Hayes, this means you are entitled to nothing. As the spouse of a disinherited beneficiary, you have no claim to any portion of this estate. The house you have been attempting to acquire through manipulation and forgery belongs entirely to your father-in-law. The savings you hope to control are beyond your reach. Every scheme you constructed over the past several years has resulted in precisely the opposite of what you intended." Lydia's attorney whispered something urgent in her ear, but she shoved him away with a violent motion. Her carefully constructed facade had crumbled entirely now, revealing the desperate, cornered creature beneath. "This isn't legal," she spat. "You can't disinherit someone based on accusations. I'll appeal. I'll take this to every court in Texas." "You are welcome to try," Grace replied calmly. "But I should inform you that the evidence presented today has already been reviewed by Adult Protective Services, who have concluded their investigation. Based on their findings, this case has been referred to the Harris County District Attorney's Office." She removed another document from her folder and slid it across the table toward Lydia. "You will be facing criminal charges for elder abuse, a Class A misdemeanor under Texas law, as well as document forgery, which constitutes a state jail felony. Depending on the prosecutor's assessment of the evidence, additional charges may be forthcoming." The color drained completely from Lydia's face. Criminal charges. Felony charges. The words seemed to strike her like physical blows, each one driving her further into the corner she had built for herself. I had remained silent throughout the proceedings, watching the destruction of my tormentor with a calm I had not expected to feel. There was no joy in this moment. No satisfaction in seeing another human being brought so low. But there was something else, something I had not experienced in years. Peace. The peace that comes from knowing that justice, delayed though it may have been, had finally arrived. I rose from my chair and looked at Lydia. She met my gaze with eyes that burned with hatred, but beneath the hatred I saw something else. Fear. The fear of a predator who had suddenly become prey. "You thought I was weak," I said quietly. My voice was steady, my hands still. "You looked at me and saw an old man, confused and helpless, easy to manipulate and control. You thought that age meant frailty, that patience meant submission, that silence meant surrender." I took a step toward her, and she flinched back as if I had raised a weapon. "But you were wrong. I have lived 72 years, Lydia. I have built bridges that will stand for centuries. I have weathered storms that would have broken lesser men, and I learned, long ago, that the most important skill in life is knowing how to wait." I paused, letting the silence fill the space between us. "My wife taught me how to fight. She spent her dying days building a fortress around me that you never even knew existed. Every move you made, every scheme you constructed, every cruelty you inflicted was documented and preserved. You thought you were hunting a helpless old man, but you were walking into a trap that was set before you even began." Lydia opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time since I had known her, she had nothing to say. Grace's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, then looked up with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "The judge has issued an emergency order," she announced. "Lydia Hayes is required to vacate any and all properties belonging to Robert Hayes within 48 hours. Failure to comply will result in immediate arrest for trespassing." Lydia stood abruptly, nearly knocking over her chair. She looked around the room one final time, searching for someone, anyone, who might offer support or sympathy. But Dr. Rourke was already gathering his papers. James Turner had turned his back. Mark sat motionless, staring at the table, unable to meet her eyes. She walked toward the door, her designer heels clicking against the hardwood floor in a rhythm that now sounded hollow and defeated. Not a single person looked her way. The weeks that followed the will reading moved with the grinding inevitability of justice, too long delayed. Lydia's attorney attempted every legal maneuver available, filing motions and appeals that Grace dismantled with methodical precision. But the evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, and the pattern of abuse undeniable. By the time the criminal proceedings concluded, even the most optimistic observer would have recognized that Lydia's fall was complete. The Harris County District Attorney charged her with elder abuse, a Class A misdemeanor under Texas law, and document forgery, classified as a state jail felony. Her attorney negotiated a plea agreement that avoided prison time but carried consequences that would follow her for years. 3 years of supervised probation, a permanent restraining order prohibiting any contact with me, fines that consumed a significant portion of the assets she had spent years trying to accumulate, and perhaps most damaging of all, a criminal record that would shadow every future endeavor she might attempt. But Texas was not the only state seeking accountability. Derek Lawson, freed from the silence he had maintained for 8 years, provided Florida authorities with the evidence he had preserved. Photographs of his mother's bruises, medical records documenting her injuries, recordings that captured Lydia's voice spewing the same venom she had later directed at me. The Florida Department of Elder Affairs reopened their investigation, and within a month, new charges were filed. Lydia now faced prosecution in 2 states for crimes separated by nearly a decade but connected by an identical pattern of cruelty. I followed these developments from a distance, receiving updates from Grace, but choosing not to attend the proceedings. I had no desire to see Lydia again, no need to witness her humiliation firsthand. The justice I had sought was not about revenge, it was about protection, about ensuring that she could never harm me or anyone else again. That goal had been achieved. The rest was simply the legal system completing its work. Mark filed for divorce the same week Lydia accepted her plea agreement. The proceedings were swift and uncontested. Lydia, facing criminal charges in multiple jurisdictions, had neither the resources nor the credibility to fight for anything. Mark was awarded full custody of Emily, along with the modest assets that remained after legal fees and fines had consumed their savings. The court, recognizing the unusual circumstances of the case, granted a temporary arrangement that surprised no one who understood what Emily had endured. She would live with me while Mark rebuilt his life, finding new employment and establishing a stable home where his daughter could eventually join him. It was not a permanent solution, but it was a beginning. Emily moved into my house on a warm Saturday afternoon in late spring. She arrived with 2 suitcases and her ever-present iPad, looking smaller and more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. But when she crossed the threshold and saw the bedroom I had prepared for her, decorated with the soft colors and gentle touches that Elaine would have chosen, her face transformed with a smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "Is this really my room, Grandpa?" she asked, running her fingers along the quilt that covered the bed. "For as long as you want it to be," I replied. She turned and hugged me with a fierceness that nearly knocked me off my feet. I held her close, feeling her small heart beating against my chest, and wondered at the strange paths that had brought us to this moment. Mark visited every weekend without fail. At first, our conversations were stilted, burdened by years of silence and the fresh wounds of recent revelations. He would sit in the living room, struggling to find words that could bridge the chasm his cowardice had created. I listened more than I spoke, giving him the space to work through his guilt in his own time. One evening, as the summer sun painted the sky in shades of orange and gold, he finally said what he had been trying to say for months. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness, Dad." His voice was thick with emotion. "I stood by while she tormented you. I chose my fear over my responsibility. I abandoned you when you needed me most." I sat in the chair across from him, the same chair where Elaine used to read her novels in the evening light. I thought of her letter, her video, her voice urging me to fight. I thought of all the preparations she had made, including the provision in her codicil that had disinherited our son for his complicity. "Forgiveness is not about deserving," I said slowly. "If it were, none of us would ever receive it. Forgiveness is about choosing to let go of anger, choosing to release the poison that bitterness leaves in your heart." Mark looked up, hope flickering in his eyes. "But trust is different," I continued. "Trust cannot be given. It must be rebuilt, one action at a time, one kept promise after another. You broke my trust, Mark. You will have to earn it back." He nodded, accepting the terms without argument. "I will, Dad. However long it takes." The back door burst open, and Emily came running in from the garden, her hands dirty and her face bright with the simple joy of a child who had spent an afternoon playing in the sun. She stopped when she saw us sitting together, her gaze moving from her father to me and back again. Then she ran forward and threw her arms around both of us, pulling us together in an embrace that felt like healing. "Grandpa, Daddy," she said, her voice muffled against our shoulders. "Can we stay together forever? Can we be a family again?" I looked at Mark over his daughter's head. Something passed between us in that moment, an understanding that transcended words. We had both been broken by the same storm. We had both survived, and now, perhaps, we could both begin again. "We are a family, sweetheart," I said, my voice rough with emotions I no longer tried to hide. "We always have been." I held them both close, feeling the warmth of their embrace, and somewhere in that warmth, I felt Elaine's presence. She had saved us all. Her love, reaching beyond death, had caught each of us before we hit the ground. 6 months passed like the slow turning of seasons, each day bringing small changes that accumulated into something profound. The house where Elaine and I had spent our life together was transformed during those months, renovated according to dreams she had shared with me years ago but that we had never found time to realize. Now, in her absence, I made those dreams real. The contractors finished their work in early autumn. White shutters framed every window, bright against the soft gray siding we had chosen together from old photographs and magazine clippings. A wraparound porch extended along the front and side of the house, wide enough for rocking chairs and summer evenings and the kind of lazy conversations that make a home feel truly lived in. Beneath each window, freshly turned flower beds waited for spring planting, their dark soil rich with promise. But the garden was Emily's project as much as mine. We began on a Saturday morning in late October, the air crisp with the first hints of approaching winter. Emily knelt beside me in the largest flower bed, her small hands wrapped around a trowel, her face serious with concentration as I showed her how to dig the proper depth for each bulb. "These are chrysanthemums," I explained, holding up one of the white flowers we had purchased from the nursery. "They were your grandmother's favorite. She always said white chrysanthemums reminded her of fresh snowfall, pure and peaceful." Emily nodded solemnly and placed a bulb in the hole she had dug, covering it with soil and patting the surface smooth. "Will they come back every year, Grandpa?" "They will. That's what perennials do. They sleep through the winter and return when the world warms again." She smiled at that, finding comfort in the idea of things that endured, things that returned, no matter how cold the season became. Mark arrived that afternoon, as he did every weekend now. He had found a new position with an engineering firm across the city, a job that paid less than his previous work but offered stability and the chance to rebuild. His apartment was small, a one-bedroom unit in a quiet complex 15 minutes from my house, but it was his own. He was learning, slowly, how to stand on his own feet again. We ate dinner together, the three of us around the kitchen table where Elaine and I had shared thousands of meals. The conversation flowed more easily now than it had in those first awkward months. Mark spoke about his work, about colleagues he was beginning to know, about small victories that would once have seemed insignificant but now felt like milestones on a long road back. I listened and asked questions and offered encouragement when it seemed appropriate. The trust between us was not fully restored, perhaps would never be completely what it once was, but it was growing, day by day, rebuilt through the patient accumulation of kept promises and honest words. We did not speak of Lydia. Her name had become something unmentioned in our household, not forbidden but simply unnecessary. She had left Texas months ago, driven out by legal consequences and social exile. The last I heard, she was facing prosecution in Florida for the case Derek Lawson had helped reopen. What happened to her there was no longer my concern. She had become a stranger, someone who had passed through our lives and left scars but could no longer inflict new wounds. The following Sunday, I took Emily to visit Elaine's grave. The cemetery was quiet in the late afternoon light, the autumn leaves drifting down from the old oaks that lined the winding paths. Emily walked beside me, carrying a bouquet of white chrysanthemums we had cut from our garden that morning. The flowers glowed against her dark jacket, bright and alive, in a place dedicated to those who had passed. We found Elaine's headstone at the top of a gentle rise, positioned where she could see the sunset. I had chosen this spot deliberately, knowing how much she had loved the evening light. The stone was simple gray granite, engraved with her name and the dates that bookended her time on earth. Emily placed the chrysanthemums at the base of the headstone, arranging them carefully the way I had taught her. Then she stepped back and took my hand, her small fingers warm against my weathered skin. I looked at my wife's name carved in stone and felt the familiar ache of loss that would never entirely fade. But there was something else now, something that had grown alongside the grief during these past months. Gratitude, wonder, a love so profound that even death could not diminish it. "You saved me, my love," I said softly, speaking to the stone, to the earth, to whatever remained of Elaine in the spaces between worlds. Even when you were gone, you never stopped protecting me. Everything you prepared, everything you set in motion, it all came together exactly as you planned. You knew me better than I knew myself, and you loved me enough to fight for me even when you could no longer hold my hand. The evening light deepened, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere in the distance, a bird sang its last song before nightfall. Emily squeezed my hand and looked up at me with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. "Grandpa," she asked quietly, "is Grandma happy now?" I looked at the sunset, at the colors streaming across the horizon like brushstrokes on a canvas too vast to comprehend. I thought of Elaine's smile, her laugh, the way she had looked at me on our wedding day and every day thereafter. I thought of her letter, her video, her voice telling me to live. "She's smiling, sweetheart," I said, feeling the truth of the words as I spoke them. "I can feel it." We stood together in the fading light, grandfather and granddaughter, bound by love and loss and the strange grace that sometimes emerges from the darkest chapters of our lives. Then, when the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, we turned and walked home together, hand in hand. The path stretched before us, winding through the cemetery gates and down the familiar streets toward the house with white shutters and a wraparound porch and flower beds full of chrysanthemums waiting for spring. Some people think old age means weakness. They look at gray hair and wrinkled skin and see only decline, only the slow diminishing of everything that once was vital and strong. They are wrong. Old age means patience. It means learning to wait for the right moment, to endure what must be endured, to trust that justice will come even when the waiting seems endless. Old age means wisdom. It means understanding that the battles worth fighting are not won with fists or fury, but with careful preparation and quiet resolve. And old age means love. Love that refuses to die. Love that reaches beyond the grave to shelter those left behind. Love that builds fortresses out of legal documents and loyal friends, and the fierce determination of a dying woman who would not leave her husband unprotected. Elaine had given me all of this. Her final gift was not the codicil or the evidence or the network of allies she had assembled. Her final gift was teaching me that I was worth protecting. I squeezed Emily's hand as we walked into the evening, and somewhere above us, I knew my wife was smiling. This story you have just heard is more than entertainment. It is a reminder that age does not diminish our worth, that patience is its own form of strength, and that love, true love, finds ways to protect us, even when those we cherish are no longer by our side. Robert Hayes was not a helpless old man waiting to be rescued. He was a survivor who had been quietly preparing for the moment when he would need to defend everything he held dear. And Elaine, even in death, proved that a mother's love and a wife's devotion can reach beyond the boundaries of life itself. If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone you love or someone who has loved you with that same fierce protectiveness, we would be honored if you would share it with others. A story only lives when it is passed from heart to heart. Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel if you have not already. Your support allows us to continue bringing you stories that matter, stories about resilience, justice, and the unbreakable bonds of family. And we want to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us what touched you most about Robert and Elaine's journey. Have you ever witnessed someone show love through protection? Have you ever had to find strength you did not know you possessed? Your stories matter to us as much as the ones we share with you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this community. And remember, it is never too late to fight for what you deserve.